So the first thing that I would like to start with is the idea that I have no idea about the NEGEV. And this was good because yesterday there was a bit of controversy about the idea of being expert in something. I don't think I'm an expert in anything. Normally, the way I would describe it is the British, they have this idea of being a desert freak. So someone that is kind of a freak, let's say, is puzzled about the desert and keeps it as a way of wondering about why are you interested about the desert. The paradigmatic idea is Lawrence of Arabia, okay, this kind of figure that is absorbed by the desert. Of course, that is a super colonial cliche, but I will start with something similar to that. I titled this The Contemporary Desert as Standpoint. So I start more with my background. I'm from Spain. I really like Jorge Luis Borges. He's not Spanish, he's Argentinian, but at least I wanted to start with something Spanish. Are you familiar with him, this writer, Borges? He writes super interesting short stories. I would recommend you to read them, but I will spoil one of them. It's a short one, so don't worry, the spoilers ahead. But it's titled Los dos reyes y los dos laberintos, meaning the two kings and the two labyrinths. The setup of the story is very simple. There are two kings, the king of Babylon, expert in city making, okay, so there is the first cities in Babylon, the Crescent, etc. So he is the paradigm of that, and then the king of Arabia, king of the desert. So the story goes that the king of Arabia went to visit the king of Babylon, and in order to make laugh of him, let's say, the king of Babylon put him in his labyrinth. It was this labyrinth, like his proper labyrinth, full of walls. You know what a labyrinth is, right? Mm-hmm. So it was. And obviously the king of Arabia got lost, and he cannot find his way out, and when he's about to die, he says, okay, help. And the king of Babylon comes, laughing at him, saying, okay, you're free to go. And the king of Arabia said, I will have my revenge. And that is the situation. So the king of Arabia took the king of Babylon, and he says, in Babylonia, didst thou attempt to make me lose my way in a labyrinth of brass with many stairways, doors, and walls. Now the powerful one has seen fit to allow me to show thee mine, which has no stairways to climb, nor walls to impede thy passage. And then he untied the bonds of the king of Babylonia and abandoned him in the middle of the desert. Okay, it's a very stupid story, okay, but it set up a very clear question, which is there is a notion of architecture that is very Western, actually, Western way of understanding the space. We were discussing it yesterday. That is about what he defines here as stairways, walls, basically setting up limits. So space is defined by borders and sort of ways of crossing. However, there is another way of thinking about the space that is the desert one, which is not about that setting up of limits. Okay, this was actually a funny way of, okay, it's a bit of thinking architecture in a different way, but it's very much the way architecture understood the desert towards the end of the 20th century. So Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari were two philosophers that were discussing the idea of space, very much in the notion of what they define as a smooth space. A space that is defined by sort of topography. If you imagine like paradigmatic view of the desert, is this kind of being inside the space, changing horizon, sort of topographic, shifting, walking around it. That's the way actually Western thought, so these are Western philosophers, were thinking about the desert. It was the time also of the decolonization, towards the end of the decolonization of Africa. And actually they were thinking the possibility, please come in. So why these philosophers wrote about that? Basically they were trying to think of a different way of understanding the nation state. Is the possibility of a community that is not necessarily the nation state. They were proposing this way of thinking of the space as a new possibility. It ended up not working too well, to be honest. But last year there were two big publications about the desert. So it's becoming like big. Sami Heni is a researcher, and so this is Columbia Books, it's like a big school of architecture, publishing a book titled Deserts Are Not Empty. Their point is very clear, and I would not enter much more than the title, which is the idea of the desert as something empty is an imperial thought that was used to justify the appropriation of the desert. So you know more or less these narratives of like the emptiness, okay, you can use it. And I think it's still a very big discussion. I think it is an important argument. And there are very interesting ideas in the book about how we think of it otherwise. But my worry goes with the second publication. So The Funambulist is another well-known like critical thinking architecture publication. And what I like about it is that the editors argue that if we follow this logic of the desert something or empty, we can start envisioning what they define like a new community that goes from Dakar is here, so it's like okay, you cannot see the pointer. Okay, so this is west of the Sahara, a community in continuity through the Sahara all the way to we will be here. Okay, so this is the NEGEV, I think, the Arabian Desert, and then the deserts in Asia. He says, okay, there is a possibility of thinking the desert as a continuous landscape. Why don't we start building up a community like that? I hope you understand the argument because it's similar to what we discussed yesterday. However, yesterday we were discussing about the idea of a digital space in continuity. Do you remember this kind of cloud? Here, he is talking about the very physicality of the desert as something continuous. That's what I'm worried about, and the discussion today is whether revisiting what I call like a triptych, like 3 moments in the recent history of the Sahara, the continuity might be also another sort of colonial system. Okay? So I'm dealing with 3 moments. The first one is in Agadez, Italy, in Niger. So it's south of the desert, of the Sahara, okay? We're dealing a bit back, but I wanted to bring something more architect-like, like more economical, in the 30s. And finally, we will visit the Western Sahara, which is the last of the colonies, European colonies, and it's Spanish, so I wanted to say something about that. But anyway, the story starts here in Niger, in Agadez, which is a beautiful city, well known for the construction of in-earth construction. So what goes on is that the city needs to be restored every so often because of the technique that they use, which is called banco. They need to restore it every so often. So there is this process of every rainy season, they need to work on the last layer of earth, and there is always the hand, and they always do it by hand, of the mason. The mosque, I call no graphic, let's say, building, is the mosque, that I don't know if you're familiar with that, that they use these homes as a permanent scaffold, let's say, that they use every year to build with their hands. So somehow you see the post, the very characteristic profile of the mosque has to do with this process of restoration. Obviously, it's related also, when I present this, people related to the festival in Genève. So there is another mosque in Genève, this time in Mali, that they have every year a festival in which the whole village works in restoration of the facade. So it's another very interesting logic of thinking of architecture in which the user basically is continuously restoring every year, leaving their traces, and it's actually a competition. So you see different neighborhoods, they get together like in this project. And it's quite beautiful because they say, okay, some people are restoring their mosque, like putting tiles, something more permanent. But no, we are into layer by layer by layer, being part of the mosque somehow. That's what they like about it. I think it's fascinating. It's a very peculiar way for me to think of architecture, like the community actually building every day. Well, every day. Every generation puts their hand on it. And it's obviously a very challenging idea of the architect for the kind of Western notion. In here, this is slightly different. there is an element of the community intervening. It's not an architect like in the European sense of like you do whatever I tell you. But it's not the whole community. They have their professionals. So they have professional masons that they do it every year. And they keep the tradition from one to another. So the question for them here is like, who restores and what are the traces that are left is quite key. Now what happened is that in 2002, they did a project, like a more, let's say, professional project, let's say, of restoration of two buildings. One is the mosque, and another one is the Palace of the Sultan of Agadez. The idea was that that was the first stone for a bigger project, which was to the application for entering the whole of the Agadez in the UNESCO World Heritage. So they were doing this pioneer project of let's restore these two. The French embassy was very interested, so the French embassy in Niger said, okay, we would like to support the project. And of course, money was needed. The Sultanate at the beginning was fine, but France said, okay, we will put money if we choose the architects. And they chose this company that is called Perez, and they are professional builders in earth. So they know about the science of building with earth and whatnot. So they sent their architect. And of course, the tension grew up until the Sultanate said, okay, enough. We don't want Christians. Okay, so what they were saying is Christians should not lay their hands on the mosque and palace. There is an element of hand, like who puts the hand, super key. And suddenly the project was about like these buildings represent their cultural heritage and religious heritage, and so they should be protected from foreign interventions. It's not any longer about protecting the building from time, like becoming a ruin, but actually from foreign interventions, so from foreign hands. It did work out. It's fine. In 2013, they entered the UNESCO World Heritage List with their own masons. So it was like the locals were building. However, that didn't remove the geopolitical tensions. Okay? In order to understand what are the tensions that are happening now through the locals, we need to trace it a bit back to the origins of the city. So Agadez became a very big point in the 14th century when the Tuaregs that were controlling that area got hold of a salt mine. So salt was a very big primary source, let's say, at that time, in order to protect like wood, etc. And it became a center in a larger trajectory of like the trans-Saharan routes, okay? So the commerce, Agadez was one of the key points of this here. Okay, in the selling of salt from here to Agadez, and then you end up in like centers, like proper centers like Timbuktu, etc. But from the region of the air, these guys were like the Sultan, so it was a big figure. Their understanding of the territory was very interesting because André Bourgeot, which is an ethnographer that has studied the Tuaregs, defined their understanding of the landscape as not something very fixed, so how do they deal with the desert? He defines it through two notions, mobility and flexibility. Mobility has to do with the routes that they were taking through the Sahara. Here we depicted it in like a proper map, but you have to imagine that as moving lines. The routes that they were taking depended a lot on where it rained, okay, and where there was access to grazing, like for the sheep and cows, etc. So they were actually moving depending on where it rained. And flexibility had to do with the network, with who the Tuaregs were in political agreement or in war. So they were continuously shifting, okay? So these lines that we fix here in a map actually were quite movable in the same way that they were nomadic. So that was like 14th century to 19th century. And what happened is that in the 20th century, with decolonization, the territory of the Tuareg, not only the Air Tuareg, but the Tuareg community in general, ended up being divided up in three different countries. So you have Tuareg people in the region in the Niger, then Mali, there is a lot of conflict going on now. I don't know if in North Mali that there is a big conflict, and then Algeria, and a bit of Libya. Okay, so if this is an ethnic group, that is, the state is divided. In Niger, what you have is that there is a lot of tension between the north, where the Tuaregs are, and the south, part of the south, where the capital is, and there is always also ethnic tension. So the state is somehow against the Tuareg. But anyway, in the big picture, what happens is Agadez is at the center of two intersecting migrant routes. So you have one coming from East Africa, and then another coming from West Africa, crossing at this point. It was another center of migratory routes, but what happened is like with the fall of Gaddafi, I think it's 2013, correctly, if I'm not wrong. Okay, so Gaddafi falls, Libya becomes a territory in civil war, and that was like a perfect ground, let's say, for human trafficking. Also trafficking of other things, like weapons and drugs and things. But what happened is that the one group within the Tuareg, which are called the Teta, they were the guys in charge actually of like controlling the sheep and these things, so they knew the routes along the desert. They became drivers, taking people from these migratory routes into Libya. So this paradigm of mobility and flexibility started entering into big conflict with the Western logic of controlling the borders. Okay, so what happens is in 2015, there is the Valletta Summit. So let me see, because here it was death of Gaddafi 2011, so it's not 13. And in 2015, Europe starts framing what they call the migrant crisis. Have you ever heard that? Like in the news, Europe understood that there was a migratory crisis. A lot of people dying in the Mediterranean. So what they do is they set up this summit in which they call not only European members, but also states from Africa, particularly from the Sahel, so south of the Sahara, in order to set up a border below the Sahara and control the people moving and the smuggling of people. So the EU enters into an agreement with Niger, the state, in order to set up a sort of external border of Europe into Agadez. The interesting thing is how they do it. So the agreement goes that the EU will put money for development of the country, and the state of Niger will forbid the movement of people in the Sahara. The EU says like they will give financial support and development and neighborhood policy tools that will reinforce local capacity building, included border control, which is a classic. But for me, it's more asylum procedures, counter-smuggling, and reintegration efforts. Reintegration effort means that I go one slide ahead, that the Nigerian state forbids the moving of the smuggling people, and they get hold of the trucks that the Teta drivers were using, so movement stops. The guys go to jail for a short time, and then there is the reintegration project through architecture. So reintegration here that the Teta drivers are not allowed to move through the Sahara. Their cars get stuck, and they are reintegrated in society in Agadez through these projects. Sorry, because it's very bright and you cannot see, but basically this is the old center of Agadez, the protected area. Okay, so that's the UNESCO protected. And these are all the projects in which the EU has put money for funding restoration projects. So what you have here is what they do is that now the local builders that they were claiming for before, you remember when there were the dispute, now the local builders are the Tela drivers. The guys that worked for a short period in jail, now they are back in town. And, okay, sorry, spoilers, it's in French. Subtitles in French? Not a great idea. Okay. This is one of the proper Tuaregs, local guys that he's an expert. And he's the one keeping the tradition, teaching the other new Masons, and he's saying, this is great because now the locals are finding a new job and they can remain in the city, and we're keeping the tradition. But the point here is that that happens through the EU funding. Okay, so he's teaching the techniques of building and restoring. Lots of people are remaining, and there is no need any longer for this kind of traveling across. So what I'm interested in is that it's not any longer about a sort of vernacular tradition versus European ways of building or something. Now there is a weird way in which the European Union is setting up external borders in agreement with the states, but through using local, the vernacular becomes a sort of political tool in a strange way. Anyway, you get the feeling. So it's a much more intricate network in which the desert and the idea of moving through the desert, of who controls the movement and who controls the limit, is a much more complex one. Okay? Was it very confusing? That's the story one, let's say, of the triptych. Number two, we go to Gardaya. Gardaya is in Algeria, and the story starts with this triptych that Le Corbusier published in a book that is titled Aircraft. So in this page, I don't know if you're familiar with books published by Le Corbusier, but he is very thorough in the use of symmetries. The traditional one is when he overlaps. Have you read Towards a New Architecture, like the typical book that he published? He uses provocative images of unexpected encounters. So the typical one is like he puts the facade of the Parthenon in the Acropolis, and underneath a car, and he's saying this is the same, like both are architecture. I don't know if you, but that's it. Here, I don't know the logic because, okay, I haven't done that much research about this particular image, but there is one page in which he says, okay, this is, here is a water hole, the nomad's outpost, parenthesis, strategy. It doesn't give a name, it doesn't give a location, it's just the idea of a strategy of dealing with a territory that has to do with a water hole. So wherever there is water, you establish the post. Underneath he says, here finally Levidon sank, nerve center of the imperial highway. The white race goes its conquering way. The filling station is a symbol of white civilization. So he puts these two images, okay? Levidon sank, which is this project. It's a bit ambiguous. It's not that, hey, here is the nomad strategy and here is the European white civilization strategy, but it's kind of weird. The story of the Bidon Sang, so this project, starts in the 1930s, early 1930s. Georges Sestian is the director of the Trans-Saharan Company, and he decides to set up, maybe I go to the image first, this, which is the route Trans-Saharien, which is crossing and connecting basically the French Empire in Africa. From Algeria in the north, Oran almost all the way, to through Gao, which was a big city and is near Timbuktu more or less, but in the Niger River, to Fort Lamy, which is I think is in Chad somewhere, like I don't even know. Within that, which you have the iconology of like the Malian, this is Gao, but you have the Bidon Sang, which is like an important point. Also through the car, so the idea is that the car will enable this connection through the Sahara. In order to set up that line, this is 1,300 kilometers from Regeni, which is here, to Thessaly. there was no connection yet, okay? But in order to set up that point of bidon sank, which is here, he was actually following the nomadic line. So he was moving from waterfall to waterfall until, so the long line is here, sorry, but this is the way he published it, like fragmented. He was following the nomadic line until suddenly he reached this point and he does like a southward turn all the way into an area where there were no waterfalls in the past, and no waterfall was to be expected. But of course, he was not in a camera. He was driving a car and with an airplane. And basically, this journey, which was some 500 kilometers, took him 2 days. He stopped for a night, and that place where he stopped was called the Bidon Sank. There was nothing in there other than they put like a petrol station, let's say, for airplanes. And the original Bidon Sank was basically that, fueling point, and an abandoned Citroen car that became an architecture. Okay, so this eventually became like a hotel, let's say, for pilots that were traveling and that were refueling and continuing their journey. And this was a vital point. For the Corbusier, this was interesting is the fact that the only building that there is really like the car, and it's like a machine for habitation. But that is the story of the Bidon Sank, okay? This kind of strange point in the middle of the desert that was following the waterfalls, but also a very Cartesian way of placing a point, which is like the middle point in a vertical line. Le Corbusier also had his own affair, let's say, with the desert, and he didn't find too much contradiction between the nomadic and the European. He did multiple trips to Algeria, but the two main ones happened in 1931, which is this one. He departed from Paris by car. He went all around Spain, and then into the desert to the coast. So he went into the Sahara. I'm only focusing in the last bit. But the point is, he goes into the Sahara, comes back, and writes this. He says, "I will limit all my words to that which makes me move from the barren, the desert, the limitless land of hunger and thirst, to splendor, from the suffering and anxiety to well-being, from terror to calm, from void to plenty, from desert to oasis." Somehow, after the trip, he made this resolution of becoming like sort of oasis architect. Like anything that he was to do was transforming the desert into oasis. He published that in an article that he calls To Controver, in which he claims that the desert has opened his eyes, let's say, into becoming a desert architect, let's say. And he published a series of drawings that focus into one city that he encountered on the way, that is called Alvaro. I cannot see it, but here. In that city, he says, these guys have found the way of producing voices in the middle of the desert, let's say. And he says, the way they do it is through the idea of the courtyard. Every house in the village has a courtyard, and all the courtyards point to one paradigmatic courtyard, which is the one of the mosque. So this drawing that he produced is a courtyard, which is looking at, it's a view of the courtyard of the mosque. And he says, all the other houses were facing outside. I think it's an interesting idea, but actually that idea he has done it already. So it's not that he discovered anything. Some years before, the ethnographer, Marcel Mercier, had published La Civilisation Urbaine of Sa, in which he was basically saying that all the houses in Gardaya are replicating the mosque. So it was not a great, and the book, which was one by an ethnographer, actually had drawing both courtyards and pointed to this idea. So he didn't, despite this idea of like, okay, I had a revelation in the desert, Le Corbusier actually was copying an idea from someone else. And if you look at the actual, so he published that in an article, but if you look at non-published material, which is his letters, he was actually saying how the desert for him was super dry. This is a letter to his lover, and he says, "Dear mom, we think of you because we are dying of thirst, and we don't know what to do or where to go. A little bit of water, we will have never imagined like it. After tonight, we will go back to the north." So he was actually kind of desperate to leave. Obviously, it's a bit of a cliché idea of being thirsty, but he says, okay, we leave to the desert, we're going to visit it, and then we will suddenly go to the north in a vertical line crossing the way to Paris, okay? But he says, Bisca, Algiers, Marseille, and Paris. My heart is fully rest. Sorry, I typo there. I have not thought for a minute of painting architectural books. So on the one hand, he was publishing this idea that I have discovered architecture in the desert, but then on the other, he was sending these messages back home saying like, there is nothing of architecture here, I haven't thought of it. The most interesting one is this one. It's a postcard that he sent to his mother. Inspired only for three things. First, because he's saying we are dying of thirst. He draws this kind of Corbusian school, okay, even with glasses, or you could read that glasses. And first, you have to imagine that his mother will be reading it in the house that Le Corbusier designed for her in the late, what they call it? Yes? Gilly, okay. So she will be thinking, okay, my son is dying out of thirst and I'm here with all the water. The second irony is that the other side of the postcard was illustrating a waterfall, like a fountain, in Gardaya, so there was no that much. But what I think, and the entire paradox is actually Le Corbusier never died of thirst. He died drowned in the lake, or in the Mediterranean. So it's like, what the heck? Anyway, what I really like about this is that suddenly he drew this line, which is Gardaya, 54 degrees, and then Paris in the north, and a vertical line. The contradiction breaks in this idea of like the two ways of understanding the space in the second journey. The second journey is not by car, it's by plane. And he narrates it like this. With my friend Durafour, which was a pilot, I left Algiers on a sun-drenched afternoon in winter, and we flew above the Atlas, so the mountains, towards the towns of the Mossad. The Mossad is a valley that we would see. Gardaya, that city that we were talking about, is in the Mossad. And he says, Durafour steering his little plane, pointing out two specks on the horizon. There are the cities you will see. Then, like a falcon, he stood several times above one of the towns, coming round in a spiral, dived just clearing the roof, and went off in a spiral in the other direction. Thus, I was able to discover the principle of the towns of the Mossad. The airplane had revealed everything to us. This text was published in Aircraft, where these photographs were published, and he's saying, we flew above and we understood the logic of the city. He produces a series of drawings that are trying to summarize, along with the idea of the courtyard, that again, he sketches some courtyards along with actual kind of survey plans of how the courtyard is shaped. But he says, we have discovered what is called the Pentapole City. So the Mossad Valley, and again, sorry because the lines in gray you cannot see, but this is more or less suddenly a depression in the desert where there used to be a river. And the city, the Mossad, is organized around 5 cities. This is Gardaya, where he was before. There is Melika, Vénitienne, Bonura, these 5, okay? Each of these cities has double territory. One that is the summer city, let's start with the winter. The winter city are these cities that he has visited. It's a city in which the center is the mosque and then the other houses are building around. But what he discovered is that in the summer, when the city is too hot, they go to a palm grove. And each city has a palm grove in which the houses are sort of replicated with a courtyard around the palm tree. And the only thing that the inhabitants take with them is the kitchen utensils. Okay, like they live in the winter and they go to this place only with the cooking useful things. For that, suddenly, I don't know why, Le Corbusier clicked on that idea that it was not a city as one. It was a pentapole, like 5 villages working at unison in 2 seasons, summer and winter. And he drew this diagram. He doesn't explain too much about it, but he defines that cities. They are Le, Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and Algiers. And he claims that this is a pentapole city, and he understands this city as one, traced by the meridian that crosses Paris. He's somehow taken this idea of the airplane, in which he understands how the city is organized, but extrapolates it to a transcontinental scale. So that idea of a pentapole city suddenly becomes a way of organizing the relationships between the metropolis and the capital. He claims that Algiers stops being a colonial city and becomes the head of the French Empire, let's say, in Africa. I don't know if you've seen the Auguste plan. There is a famous several iterations that Le Corbusier did of Algiers. I'm not completely convinced, but his logic was a bit about trying to understand this kind of pentapole scheme in a really big scale. What is interesting about this story for me is that it's not that it's an imperial line, like super colonial kind of thing, but he's borrowing a notion that he discovered in the desert, appropriating it into a new logic of colonial kind of politics. Okay, applying this pentapole scheme suddenly into a new way of understanding France and the relationship with Africa. Okay, that's story number 2. We enter into the last one, and I'm gonna rush now because are we on time more or less? We're fine. Are you guys too tired so far? Or?
No, that's in the all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Western Sahara, 1980s. In the 1950s, so, the Western Sahara was a territory that was a colony of Spain. It was divided like that in the Berlin Conference, or it was given to Spain, but Spain didn't do anything really until the 50s. In the 50s, there is this book that is very interesting. They sent an ethnographer, a Spanish ethnographer, that was working in Oxford. So he was a kind of expert, and go and visit the nomadic people that live there. It's a beautiful book, and the conversations are fantastic. But he published this series of drawings that are depicting how the encampment, let's say, of the nomadic people are set up in relationship to the grazing grounds. Okay, so these are all different tents, and how they relate to the grazing grounds is not very important. He does this kind of map. So in 1 year, there is this guy that is called Brahim Ul Alian, that in 1 year, this is how he moved in the territory. Okay, so he's moving around. But the most fascinating one, for me at least, is this one, which is called Desplazamientos de Muhammad Abdallah during his Displacements of Muhammad Abdallah during his life. This is a conversation that in the book takes like, I don't know, like 10 pages or something, and the guy, Muhammad Abdallah, is explaining his life and where he was born, where he was moving. And meanwhile, he's tracing the trajectories that he's doing along the ground. These are the borders of the Spanish colony, okay? So they are super abstract. But anyway, this is the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the territory where he moved. For me, there is something very moving in the fact that it's kind of biographical, but especially in these kind of lines that expand, then they condense somewhere, and especially because they are drawn next to the latitude and the grid, but disregarded it. So the guy was moving around, and that was his sort of understanding. It's beautiful for me also because he says, until 1952. 1952 is when this conversation happened. It was the life of Muhammad Abdullah, but it's also a year in which the nomadic form of living in the Western Sahara starts stopping, let's say. The nomads start settling in the new cities that Spain is setting up. And this kind of, it's almost like a testamentary book, like, okay, it's the end of this form of living. It has a very nice analysis of the Haimas, like how they transport their architecture. Anyway, but it's kind of the end of that form of life. Why did it happen? It happened because around that time, Spain discovered one of the wealthiest mines of phosphate. So phosphates were used for fertilizers in agriculture, and it was a moment of like, they were starting to think what are the limits of growth, like the planet is growing a lot, how can we provide food for that many people? Phosphates were big, but they were big especially in Morocco. So next to Morocco, sorry, it's in Spanish, I just realized, but Morocco is the country to the north. They got independence in that years, but Spain discovered this mine of Bucra. So Bucra is one of the wealthiest phosphate mines, but it was some 100 kilometers away from the sea. So suddenly the project was about how to transport the phosphate, the ground, let's say, from Bucra into the sea and into the world. So it's a very strange project. It's basically the longest conveyor belt in the world. It's 100 and something kilometers of just a conveyor belt. And they thought of it as a sort of the biggest open air factory kind of thing. So it's literally one line, and the engineers traced it like that. It was one line that was continuously moving in the territory. Super abstract logic, like there is no relationship to anything other than itself and where it starts and where it ends. And the only thing they defined really at the beginning of the project, obviously when they built it, they were defining a bit more, is the section, how the section worked. There were two problems. One was the wind, that obviously if you're transporting dust, which the phosphate was dust, you have a problem when there's a sandstorm. And the other is the sand. So the phosphate gets less purity, let's say, if it's affected by the sand. I think the solution was quite brilliant, which is rather than having just a horizontal conveyor belt, they designed a conveyor belt that with the weight of the phosphate will take already the shape to protect itself from the wind, okay? So the section is here, okay? So normally conveyor belts are like flat, but when the weight of the phosphate will fall, they will take this form, this shape. So you're protected from the wind, okay, the weight itself. And then they just cover it in a very cheap, like a steel protection from the sun. And with that simple solution, I mean, they were German engineers, so it was like same solution for the whole throughout. So this was the kind of drawings they were producing. And there was only reference to one point, which is, it was a tricky one, which is the area of dunes. That territory there is Hamada, mainly it's like a rocky desert. There is no a lot of sand, except in that point. And that's the only point that they carefully sort of draw in a very strange way. So the problem there was that the ground was moving and the dunes might shift, and that will affect the conveyor belt. So the decision was simply to lift it from the ground, like 50 meters, and let the dunes underneath just flow. It's very strange because even in the depiction, it has some sort of, okay, for Spain, the desert was kind of an oriental way of fascinating. So for them, this was a sort of magic carpet ride, but over the dunes for the phosphate. And the whole purpose was, I think what is interesting is that it's the moment in which nomadic life started being fixed on the ground. The nomads were fixed to the cities. In fact, they were working for the mines. But you have another ground that is suddenly on the move. It was about transporting the desert. It was about fixing nomads to the ground. but having the capacity of continuously moving desert into exports in the world. Mainly it came to Spain, but for example, the first delivery was to Japan, it was all around the globe. And was somehow how they were framing. So they produced this series of documentaries that are about that, starting obviously with the name, and they start in Point Bucra mine, so where they open the soil, and it's about how smooth the whole apparatus is. So it was about this conveyor belt that was just simply moving the ground into the sea and then leaving. The project didn't last very long. It started operating in 1973, and in 2 years it ended. It ended partly because this kind of smooth way of moving grounds around was politically very tense. Morocco had most of the, Morocco, I think, and the USSR and the US were the only phosphate producers. Morocco had the majority of the market, and they were supported by the states. Morocco had recently got independence. I don't know, do you know what the project of the Great Morocco is? No idea. No? When Morocco got independent, there was one political party that were claiming that Morocco was not limited to the borders that were set up by France, but actually the whole of Mauritania, part of Algeria, and the whole of Western Sahara was to be the Great Morocco. That entered into conflict with everyone, like with Algeria a lot, and with Spain quite a lot. To the point that and then through the United Nations and the support of the US, they started pushing the decolonization of that, so Spain to leave. And Spain did leave. In 1975, there is the Green March. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically lots of civilians from Morocco walk to the border. I don't have the... Anyway, they crossed the border, the Spanish army didn't do anything, and there was this moment of, what the heck, negotiations started, and Spain withdrew. Second negotiations, so there is not a lot of what was the content, but part of the content is that Spain would leave if Spain was to keep 35% of the production of the phosphate. So the Bucra mine was part of the big conflict. Okay, so in the Green March, they crossed that, and suddenly that line that used to be the northern border is the one that is blurred. It's blurred because Spain left with no clear agreement on who was to be in charge of the territory. Morocco entered, obviously, with the army, and they claim, and even nowadays, they claim that it's part of Morocco and it's the southern provinces. Mauritania also entered from the south, and they started a war. A big group of the Sahrawi population, of the locals, they left, and they went to Tindouf, which is in Algeria, and is the oldest refugee camp active. This is from 1975. They are still there. From their exile, they set up a new country, let's say, that is not recognized by the United Nations, and everyone started entering into war. Mauritania stayed there for some years, but eventually withdrew. And effectively, in the 80s, the war was between Morocco and the Polisario Front. Have you ever heard of that? It's basically the army of the people of the Sahrawis that are in Tindouf. The war was basically a guerrilla war, like incursions from Tindouf into the territory. The Bucra mine was obviously the first objective. Okay, so the first attack was against the conveyor belt to stop the flux there. But since 1981, Morocco tried to flip the logic of it. And the way they did it, instead of this guerrilla war, it became a war of gaining territory. So they set up a series of walls, first protecting the Bucra mine and the capital, El Aaiún. But then, as in 3 years, they started building this series of walls that were separating what they were calling the useful ground, let's say, which is in the coast and the mine, etc., from the desert. And the Sahrawis will have control. You have to imagine that the line that is dividing Mauritania is a bit meaningless, okay? So on the ground, there is no actual division. And it's that line which is defining how the territory is. The point is that the line is actually a fake dune. So it's made out of sand. Obviously, there is a mining field next to it, but it's basically some 3,000 kilometers of artificially produced dunes with a series of fortresses in between. But it's basically sand dividing desert from desert. It's a very kind of weird architectural project. I mean, this is it's a wall, so it's like kind of proper architecture somehow, but in a gigantic scale. You can trace it with Google Earth, and it's quite beautiful because there are areas in which it goes through like a sand dune, and you can see the trajectory, then the sand, and then it continues. And so it's like, regardless of what is in the ground, this is a new border. It seems like a bit of a surreal project, but actually, this is the border that was set up. So in 1991, the United Nations, or through the United Nations, they reached an agreement, a peace agreement. But the peace agreement was based on that restricted area, let's say, of a buffer zone, defined by the wall. And this is the situation how it is nowadays. So since 1991, very little has happened. Supposedly, both countries have agreed that there was to be a referendum of independence. They cannot reach an agreement on who is to vote, because Morocco is saying, okay, only people that live in Western Sahara can vote, but obviously it's all Moroccan people living there now, or mostly. And the others say, okay, no, it has to be the people that were living there when Spain left. It doesn't really matter. I think it's like an stasis, it's a start, and there's not going to be an easy solution to that. But what is interesting for me is a shift from a nomadic space that was traced by movement and trajectories into a very strange walled space. What happens is that, okay, for me, I mean, it's a very curious project. But in the last 5 years, what has happened is that the wall has become a reference for all the other walls that are emerging. So in the last 5 years, Tunisia has started building their border with Libya in the same way, with this kind of walls, sand walls. Libya actually departed from a project that started with the Italians, so they recovered this kind of line. And Egypt is making the border. But it's Algeria, the one that has basically built up the whole border, and it's like 5,000 kilometers of sand walls. This is in order to control the movement of people and goods. As I was saying before, there is a lot of weapons and drugs and migrants moving around. And the way they conduct it is through this build-up of really paradoxical walls. It's not that it's impossible. It's like 3-meter walls that you can walk through, but they are all systems of detection. So going back into the idea that we were discussing originally of this kind of continuous community through the Sahara, I would say that the situation is much more complex. There are very weird architectural projects, let's say, like the one we've seen in Agadez, that is about migration routes and borders, but it's also about UNESCO protection and restoration of architecture. There is Le Corbusier, like tracing these kind of meridians, but it's also about what he learned in the Mossad, in the Pentapole city, or in this case, this kind of super strange sand dunes fakely built. I think I wouldn't say like what is the solution or anything. My argument was only that it's not as smooth and sort of continuous. Going back to this paradox, not this paradox, the story of Borges, I don't think it's any longer about one king and the other and who is building a labyrinth. I mean, Arabia, let's say, the desert is actually being built through fake dunes and things like that. But what is interesting for me is the division between like Western architecture and nomadic form is kind of being blurred. But what is interesting for me is that, and that's why I call it a standpoint, is that actually all these problems of, not these problems, these contemporary ideas of like migration, restoration, the climate crisis we were talking about, there are many ideas that we were, these are things that happen everywhere, but actually the desert has its own particular standpoint. Like you can see through the lenses of the desert, the political problematics in a different way. So you can have a slightly different understanding of what things could be through the desert. And that's it. I don't know if you have any reactions or any thoughts or...
You talked about the Bugara mine, right? About that line that was separated into two borders. So who were the workers working that mine? They were for both areas? Or?
Super good. So Bukra, there were Spanish engineers, like a more white collar, like the high ranking, let's say, they were Spanish, military and partly. Okay, so back then Spain was a dictatorship. So the company that was in charge of that mine, it was a state company. It was called Minsa, and they were the guys in charge of the whole project of Bukra. Okay, workers were mainly from everywhere, actually, also from the peninsula, from the Spain nowadays, let's say. But many nomadic people found jobs in here. Okay, so they were working in the mines. It was a well-paid job. I mean, it was decent. It was a decent thing. But part of so in the late 70s, independence movement and political sort of connection started. Because Spain was a dictatorship, it was illegal to do any political party. But many of so it's when the moment when this Polisario front started, is the front of liberation of the Sahrawi territories, let's say. It's a bit more complex name. But their first act ever was a terrorist attack, let's say, in the mine itself, when it was Spanish. So it was even before Spain left and everything. So basically they burned a section of the conveyor belt. So this was important for them. Later on, many of these people were the ones living, once Spain left, they are the ones that enter in conflict with Morocco. They set up the SAR, I don't know how to call it, it's basically a Sahrawi state, let's say. And they are the ones that were living in Tindouf and doing these incursions into the territory. So there is a bit of a mix there. I mean, Tindouf itself, there is an amazing publication that there was a studio, like what you're doing now, the studio, but from ETH, like from Zurich, that went to analyze the architecture of the refugee camps. Obviously, it's like super weird because they are meant to be temporary haimas, like tents, but they've been there for 50 years almost. So they have everything set up like super interestingly, like there are hospitals that they run. It's a very interesting place on this, if you're interested into the permanent and ephemerality, etc.
I think it was part of the Studio Basel.
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read a bit.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was that the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Any other?
I didn't quite get if the sand walls are like are they tall or are they just symbol like of a border?
Mm-hmm. So there is not a lot of accessible material, let's say, for this. So as part of the Desert Archive course, you want to get into, like Morocco will not allow me to see the archives of that, but maybe to you it does. There is not a lot. I found one very interesting video that a friend's TV, they did like a documentary. And it's nice because sometimes you see the wall, like suddenly there is this dune, and then around you see the head of a soldier that is there. They are not about not jumping, they are not fences. The logic of it is that if these attacks from Tindouf were to happen, first, it was more difficult to go with a truck, and especially they could not flee back into Algeria. So it was about reducing the speed, let's say, of the incursions. So they are very strange as fans. They are not big. I'm really interested on what is the construction system of it, because it's really, in the video there is a bit of, how do you call in English, the machines that move, bulldozers, let's say, like just simply moving that. And then guys actually throwing sand to polish it, let's say. So there's not much more than that. Obviously it has the other side, which is the minefield, okay, which is a big problem. But as an architectural system, I have improved this, but actually they copied, I think, partly from in the 6-day war. There was a
battery.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
left line.
The Valesco line supposedly is the inspiration for this. It's not the Chinese wall or anything. It's just see. And I
The
think
fellow also in Israel. Because also at the end
Yeah, but I think even the Chinese wall, in a sense, was a representation or a symbol. It was, all long lines, and also the wall here today, it has hundreds of kilometers that are open as well. So, in a sense, it really echo it being an idea more than a.
yeah. Do you remember yesterday the guy that I showed you, Bagnol, this guy that was obsessed with moving of sand? I have to see whether this moves, because that would be super interesting. If that they were shifting, that would be amazing. But what is happening is that I've done quite a bit of research of there is a number of geographers from Spain that were first mapping the territory. Their claim was always that first, there was not a lot of sand. It was mostly rocky desert. And two, that line is meaningless. There is no, it's a continuous thing. So how do you set up a border there? Eventually, what is interesting for me is not that it belonged to a space of war, let's say. What is interesting for me is that since 1991, that there was peace, the sand dune is there, and is eventually becoming a sort of a geographical border that was never there. Okay, it never existed. They set it up, but it's artificially produced, which is kind of scary. It's like a very, I don't know, the fact that you can build up like geographical borders is like, wow, it's quite impressive. So it's strange that it's becoming untouched. So I don't know, it's a weird place, I think.
But yesterday we talked about dunes that are moving consistently. So it's like marking the border on the sea with the wave. Like it
Exactly.
will eventually.
That's a good method. I haven't proved that. I haven't proved whether it moves or not. Supposedly, because there is a lot of satellite images, like you can trace this in the satellite. It's fine. It's big enough to see it.
And also you can quite zoom, not like here that I can just burn the things.
Well, kind. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, but
I don't know to which extent you can reach it.
so even these lines that I have drawn, okay, partly has to do when the UN set up there is a mission for the referendum of the Western Sahara, okay? There are not that many UN missions in the world, maybe 10 or something. And one is there, and it has been there since the 90s. But they were tracing that line. So I'm very keen on remapping out of satellite imagery how this is, but it's 1,000 and something kilometers. So it's like if you zoom in, it's like if you were moving pixel to pixel, like it would be crazy job. But if someone wants to do it, that would be super cool. Yeah.
Alvaro, I think what's I think, first of all, no one said that, so thank you so much for your presentation. It was really inspiring and amazing job you're doing. So it's the second time now, so it's always very interesting. I think that, and I'm saying it kind of to the students, what you're trying to do here is, I think, is really inspiring for us, because you're in a very subtle way trying to deliver a message that maybe in the beginning it's quite not that easy to hear in a sense, because a lot of the material right now, especially being taught and conversed in the Western world, is about, you know, this non-Western past, and how it sort of has a logic of its own that is valid, and there are amazing movements that are actually kind of growing their independence from that Western history. But yet, you know, there's some kind, there's at least for me in a conversation with friends as well, there's this notion that it's almost comfortable for the West to hear that,
against the,
right? And I think what we hear here, also in some research that we're doing and through looking at projects like the old city of Beersheba even, that there was modernism in other places in the world as well. There was Ottoman modernism and it was Afghan modernism, and you had very similar ideas actually present throughout the territory for thousands of years, yet the same way that people like Mies kind of changed their name, or coining the machinistic aspect of architecture, there's something very comfortable for the West to always kind of claim modernity, even now that it seems as if, you know, so there's something that is very comfortable with publications like that of the Funambulist and things like that, in this kind of very postmodern way. So I think it's a very important voice, I think, in current discourse in relation to that, because it's, first of all, it's less lazy, and it's unbelievably nuanced. So really thank
what
you
to
for
do
that.
about it. So for example, in the case of the Western Sahara in Spain, okay, so it's our last colony and it could be a tense thing. No, man, everyone makes fun of it. So it's quite plain to say like how badly Spain did it. I mean, because you make fun of yourself. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's what you're saying, okay? It's easy from the West to self-criticize. But the point in Spain is like, okay, but what do you do after? And we had a lot of, the problem here is that Spain is not involved in that. They don't take any responsibility of what happened there. And my problem is that with this lecture, I'm not taking any responsibility either. So it's not, it can be nuanced or whatever, and it can be fun sometimes, but I'm not sure how I'm contributing. But that's what I will only say, what would you do? Like I throw the question back into you, because there's not an easy question. I'm with you that we should overcome this idea that being critical towards the West is, because it has become cliche in itself. But what to do next is difficult. I'm not sure.
No, surely. I mean, it's just another stage in that lineage from, you know, the 90s on. It's just refresh.
Do you find any of these conditions in the? No. Okay, I'm gonna throw a question because I haven't presented yet. We presented the big desert archive course, let's say, but you know that we divide in three. I will try to work with you on this idea of connections between things that are happening in different places. I have done this triptych. So let's imagine I would like to work with you with this idea of triptychs. It can be more than three, okay? But it's connecting things that are normally conceived as unrelated. I wonder if you relate in any way what we've seen with anything going on in the NEGEV.
So I worked in some company that were involved in a mine contract. So that mine was in after Dimona, and the mine road was through a Bedouin
Village.
Bedouin colony. So the Bedouin come to when we visit the mine, but you come and tell us you don't going to be here because it's moving to our account. So that contract was cancelled because of that. It happened like three years ago, something like that. So it's not very border, but it's like a war over resources and areas.
And the borders that are constantly moving is something that we are familiar here in Israel, you know. And actually, like the border you showed us in the Sahara, it doesn't even look like a border. It is a part of the desert. It is like maybe it is like I don't know. It didn't seem like a very harsh border, and that's I don't know. It was interesting. Like to see different kinds of borders, but kind of similar, though.
I will explain a bit more because I was trying to make sort of fun of this. This works not that much physically as a hard border, let's say like a fence. It has to do with the mines, okay? Obviously people don't go close to it because of the mine. And it has to do with this. So these fortresses are set up not that far from one another, it's less than 10 kilometers. It's about surveillance. So what they had is that they were supported by the states, okay? They put a lot of new technology in the 80s, okay? Now it's a bit obsolete. But it's about the early steps of like surveillance through non-material ways. So it was radio and control of the transition. I haven't entered into that much because I think that is obsolete already. So, but the ones in the big ones, like all in Algeria and etc., is based partly on the possibility of tracking. Not that much stopping people to pass, but to track how they move. Okay. So these are actual sand dunes. They are built, they are physical. It's not that I made up this drawing, but they are not fences, let's say. You can cross through them if you can climb a dune.
There's the little Israeli anecdote in relation to the normalization of the relationship between Morocco and Israel 2 years ago or something had to do with Trump's agreement to sell certain weaponry to Morocco and his non-recognition of Sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe in a way, like our unit trip somehow we're always in some way connected to that same conflict. There's,
in the Arab states, let's say, like Morocco has always historically played a very peculiar role. I don't know. I know more about the relationship between Morocco and Spain, not with the rest of the Arab world. But yeah, there is. I think it's one of the few that accepted like Jerusalem as being capital. I don't know where that relationship goes back to, but in the world, Israel was somehow involved in the world between the Sahrawi
and then in the second stage, the Trump agreement involved certain Israeli weaponry systems to be sold to Morocco.
And you think it's related to the line? No idea.
Not necessarily to the line, but countering the line in the sense somehow developing Morocco's ability to control the sub-Saharan territory better with newer weapons than the 80s.
Interesting, because that is really recent.
Can I say
Yeah, so good.
At first, I'll say like gracias, thank you. That was so interesting, and actually there's a sentence I really liked that you have said, keep a tradition from one to another from the mosque project. It was so interesting because actually thinking of building and like when you think about culture, keep culture, and especially in modern culture nowadays, in modern architecture nowadays especially, thinking of building and materials shapes me when you think about the culture, how to represent culture during architecture. But now I can see people through that as well, through the keep the tradition and culture through architecture. And it was so interesting how people involved in restoration, developing.
Gracias to you. But how do you? I like the idea of there is there is a way of passing knowledge that is about this tradition of one expert, let's say, passing the baton to the next one. And then there is the more regulated education for architects, let's say. You are right now in a more, it's not super formal, and I think there are great things going on, but eventually I don't know if you belong that much to the traditional passing of knowledge. Does that make sense? Only the fact that I'm here from Spain, like telling you whatever stories about the desert, is not the traditional passing of the knowledge, let's say. So how would you address the other vernacular, like a traditional knowledge is there such a thing in the Negev, you think? A way of doing architecture in the desert that is more tradition-based?
Yeah, actually, I do support the building that has history and of something, not just that simple modern architecture that we have, that they all are on.
So you as architect, how would you intervene, let's say, even in the process of protection and restoration of that? How would you intervene in there? Because it's not a given solution, I think.
I'm actually working in that, but
Nice.
actually I believe that the ground has to to express the identity of it. It has to reflect itself as well, not the needs of the human that live in that building. So yeah.
So it's not only about function, let's say, of solving a habitat problem, but about identity. But if something from this is that even in the Agadez case that I have shown you, there is this will of keeping a tradition through local people building it. But even that is entangled in bigger questions like the European Union sort of trying to control the migratory routes. So I think as architect, partly the idea here is that there is no solution. It's open to you in the future. You're going to be that architect that might be in charge of restoring. So if something I would say that it's good to understand that problematics of the identity is not so simple. They are very complex. And I think here even more. So, but definitely to keep it as a concern is super important. I don't have a solution for that. But it's good. And where are you're working in the Negev? Not necessarily, or yes? Your interest in the local traditions are in Beersheba or somewhere else?
Everywhere.
So you're coming to Spain to see how the local people might work. Nice.
Thank you again.
We can pop up.
And we're so happy that we start the course with Desert Archive. And
We meet next week.
we meet next week, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you for staying until this late. Thank you.
Thank you.